She was a shape against the white, a small, deliberate silhouette huddled on the shoulder of I-84, where the interstate curves like a fist into the hills. The storm had already taken the world into its own gray. Snow moved sideways, a steady, cruel kind of drift that erased the line between road and ditch. Her coat was too thin for the wind and too thin for the surprise of being left. Under the coat, a life rounded her, laid enough along that she kept one hand unconsciously pressed to the place where the child lived, as if touch could steady both of them. Headlights swept past and failed to see her. A pickup passed at speed, and then a sedan, windows crusted with ice. It felt, in those first long minutes, as if the highway had decided to keep going without her. A rig materialized through the white, a long wheelbase, 2 sets of lights blazing like distant stars. Its engine hummed a low, patient sound, diesel settling into the bones of the truck. The driver slowed before he saw her. Maybe it was the way she stood, half-slumped, chin hollow, breath a small cloud, or the way the storm seemed to want to swallow her outline. He eased the rig to the shoulder and killed the engine, and for a moment there was only the fan-you-could-not-count whisper of the storm, and the truck's parking lights painting the snow in a soft, pale orange. The man in the cab climbed down without hurry, boots making prints that filled with fresh snow. He wore a worn cap, a heavy jacket with grease-darkened cuffs, and a kindness that was practical more than theatrical. His name was Eli, though she would learn that later. He carried a thermos and a folded wool blanket, small, ordinary things, but the kind of things that change how someone feels inside, seen, tended to, kept from freezing. He moved toward her with the thermos cupped in both hands. "You decent?" he asked. His voice was gravel and low, not loud to cut the storm, but steady enough to be a lifeline. She blinked, the movement of her face meeting his like a small confessing. She swallowed. "They left. I don't know." The sentence broke off because the wind took it. No one wanted to help a pregnant stranger on a highway in a blizzard. It was a long list of small dangers and a longer list of excuses. "Hop in," he said simply, not asking, not offering sermon, not peering at her belly like it was evidence. He lifted the blanket over her shoulders and handed her the thermos. "Hot coffee or tea, what do you want?" The cab smelled of warmed vinyl and diesel and peppermint, stale peppermint for a chip tin. There were layers of other smells too, a faint scent of soap on his jacket, the metallic tang of a life lived around engines, the comfort of a small functioning order in a world that had lost its map. She accepted the thermos like a treaty. Inside the cab, the heating hummed and the world narrowed to the radius of that small space. 2 seats, a bunk, a box of maps, a CB radio with a frayed antenna. He placed a folded blanket on the bunk and gestured toward the heater. "You okay to lie down for a bit? There's a motel in town. I can get you a room, sit with you while you call whoever you need." She hesitated. There was a dignity in her that refused to be made small by gratitude. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. He shrugged, as if burden were a stale word people used when they wanted to stay quiet about the hard thing they felt. "Nobody's keeping score out here." He set the thermos between them and opened the CB for a moment, an old habit of truckers, making the road a web of people. He didn't speak much into it, just a brief, practical check that the storm wouldn't close the pass, but the cab's small rituals made safety feel possible again. She told him her name in pieces, like bits of a puzzle. Maya. She said it once and then folded it away, as if the name itself needed shelter. Eli asked the necessary things, how far along, when last saw a doctor, but never pried for reasons to feel sorry. His questions were tools, not torches. When she admitted she had nowhere to go that night, he did not say something triumphant. He made a plan, a motel room for the night, a volunteer number of a shelter 2 towns over that worked with pregnant women, a promise to call the shelter when they reached warmth. He handed her his phone to make the calls. His passcode was written on a sticky note stuck to the sugar jar. She called the shelter with hands that trembled not from the cold but from the vertigo of being believed. Before he drove her off the shoulder, another man rolled past, a high beam catching the truck and her silhouette, and didn't stop. He did. That was the simplest, most consequential thing, to stop. If this story is the kind that holds meaning for you, go ahead and subscribe. There are more like it here. It matters when someone sees what most others don't. The motel was a small, beige place with a neon sign half busted, and a clerk who looked like he'd seen many kinds of despair and carried his own. Eli negotiated with the mood of the clerk by being clear, by paying for a room like he was buying safety. He left her with the name of the shelter, a small stack of cash in an envelope, and a handshake the way fishers of men might have once exchanged ropes. He refused to make her a story to tell. He refused to make himself the hero. He simply kept his word.
That first night in the motel room, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of other people's travel, Maya slept with her hand on her belly and thought in fragments. The fight in her parents' voice, the slammed door, the silence after, the regret held tight to teeth, the word shame like a stone. She thought of the small, stubborn housework of living, finding a doctor, making a plan, the way food tasted when you could afford only the cheapest cans. She had not planned for any of this.
She had imagined once a different kind of future. A job that paid enough to rent a place, a small kitchen table, a child's first laugh. Shame had shoved those imaginings to the edge of her mind the way a storm pushes loose papers into a gutter and forgets which page belongs to what. Eli did the practical things over the next days without fuss. He checked the heat in the motel. He called a volunteer at the shelter. Her name was Gail, who worked evenings at a highway convenience store and ran a small drive-by network of donations, and he promised to bring him a list of women's group meetings. He didn't make speeches. He made phone calls, borrowed a folding bed from a rest stop manager who owed him a favor, and moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to measure help in useful increments. Maya watched him at first with suspicion. Men in big trucks had come and gone in her life already, men who offered pithy condolences and nothing else. Eli's kindness was different because it was repeatable. He returned the next morning, not as a single grand gesture, but with a thermos and a string of small, practical things. A list of prenatal clinics that took payment plans, the number of a lawyer who volunteered time, a bag of warm socks, and a sweater with sleeves long enough to hide hands that were still embarrassed to be cold. She began to tell him the story in pieces, because it was easier to hand the facts over than to make the whole thing a monument of grief. Her mother had called one morning, voice flat and brittle as a frozen leaf. "This can't happen," she'd said, as if the map of their family could be folded to exclude a child. Her father's silence had been a different kind of absence. He hadn't come to the door when the suitcase arrived. They had told her where she could sleep in their minds, not at their table, not in their house. The man who had come with promises had left when the danger of being caught became too likely. She had nosed the baby tenderly under her ribcage and decided she would not let that decision, other people's fear, become the last word. "One thing," she said to Eli on a late drive out of town, hands cupped around a coffee. "I want to make a place where no one has to stand on a highway and wait for headlights." He looked at her without lofting pity in his face. "You mean a drop-in place? Warm? People? Help with appointments? Meals? Like a daytime spot?" "Yes," she said. "A place where we teach the basics. How to read a form. How to get a baby a cross seat. How to find a doctor who listens. Not charity exactly. A workshop, a kitchen, a place." The words came faster. "A place where we're not invisible." Eli listened the way talkers listen to the radio at night, patient, tuning in so they don't miss the part where a voice matters. Then he did something that might have been small or enormous depending on how long you had been waiting. He said, "Okay, tell me what you need."
That was the opening more than any official document could be. It wasn't about him building the place. It was about him offering the tools, the ladder, the phone number, the willingness to move boxes. Over the next weeks, those tools turned into actions. He borrowed a flatbed to move donated furniture. He called a guy he knew at the union and asked whether they had a small grant for community aid. They wired a modest amount to cover utilities for 3 months. Eli drove back roads hauling boxes of shelving, a battered kettle, 2 folding tables, and a child's donated high chair that had stickers peeled from where someone else's little fingers had practiced pulling off a sun. The space they found was an old diner back room just off the main street in a town that had once been busier. The diner's neon sign had been dark for years. Its windows were streaked, and its booths bore the ghosts of conversations that had once been less hurried. The back room smelled of old coffee and rust, but it had a heater, a sink that still worked, a door to the alley where deliveries had once arrived. It had a room for a small office and a tiny bathroom that could be made clean. Seeing it for the first time, Maya pressed a palm against its flaking paint like she was testing whether the idea itself might crumble. She imagined turning one end into a reading corner, the other into a place to warm formula bottles, a table where a volunteer could sit with a woman and help her fill out forms. She imagined teaching someone to write their name, the way a person reclaims a small piece of civic dignity. The room was nothing like the barn that could be wide and raw, but it had the same possibility. From a place abandoned, you could build a place that kept people. They worked in small, clear shifts. Eli drove the truck at dawn to pick up old crates of chairs donated by a church in the next county. Gail, the convenience store woman, brought coffee and a thermos full of chili. Local kids off from school scraped paint while their parents watched, and a retired teacher named Mabel swept and organized the books that had been sitting in a storage unit.
Maya painted the sign by hand during spare afternoons, choosing a name that felt right and not too loud: Hearth and Hands. The sign would hang crooked until they could afford real fastenings, but crookedness had character. Word moved through the town in fragments. Some people came out of curiosity. Others came with caution and an inherited glossary of contempt they had learned in Sunday pews and grocery store gossip. Who's behind it, people asked, over transactions and in the church parking lot. Seems like something nobody's going to maintain. The rumor mill churned the easy assumptions: that a trucker wouldn't know how to run a nonprofit, that a mother alone could never keep the lights on, that this was another one of those projects that would take people's pity and then vanish when the grant cycle ended.
Maya met the questions in public meetings with a kind of quiet that had power. She talked about lists and schedules, about a simple menu: 3 meals a week, 2 literacy sessions, an on-call nurse once a month, not as pleas, but as logistics. She learned fast how to write a basic budget and how to ask for a local church hall for free the first Saturday of a month. She learned to fold a voice into civic language. "We want to help women navigate these forms," she said, not "I need help." People listened differently when language was practical. They could then decide whether to support or not based on details, not gossip. Eli kept coming back. Always in the background, he did what he had done at the start: small, dependable acts. There was the time the center's old electric heater failed on a damp afternoon, and he drove 5 miles in the dark to borrow a heat lamp from a friend. The time he borrowed a generator for a weekend while they waited for an electrician's visit. The time he convinced a diner owner named Lou to donate batches of soup after closing. He did not take control. He made calls, he offered muscle, he lent a name. He taught Maya how to move a pallet without getting thrown off balance, how to keep a logbook of donations, how to ask for receipts so they could show that money had been spent. Some of the trust settled in places small enough to swallow without fanfare. The way Maya would hand Eli a list and he would check it off and call back 2 hours later with an answer. The way he would stand at the doorway of the warming room and listen while she took a first tentative group of women through how to enroll for prenatal nutrition assistance. There was gratitude between them, but also limits, and both respected those lines. There were moments of silence heavy with things unspoken, losses, old regrets, but Eli's presence was a steady mechanical precision rather than a tide that would sweep everything away. He was a facilitator of resilience, not its author. The first real test came in a week that began like any other and then rearranged itself. It snowed, soft at first, then with a hunger that snapped branches and brought power lines down in whole neighborhoods. A fell tree took out a transformer on the main street, and half the town's lights went out for hours. Hearth and Hands lost power. The heater clicked and then fell silent. The old diner's windows fogged with breath. They had 5 mothers and 2 toddlers inside when the lights went. No one panicked. They set out the kettle warmed on a camp stove Eli had brought, candles in jars that Mabel had gathered from somewhere, and placed wool blankets over the children's laps. Outside, the wind hammered. Inside, someone began to sing a children's rhyme, half to keep the toddlers amused, and half to keep a voice steady in a room that could have filled with panic. A man from down the street, who had been skeptical the first time he saw them working on the sign, showed up with a box of batteries and a flashlight on his porch like an apology in action. Eli arrived with a generator that his cousin lent, a tangle of extension cords, and the particular orderliness that belongs to people who live by checklists. He set it up in the alley and led a careful, non-dramatic series of moves. Move the freezer closer, plug this in, test the light in the reading corner, check the smoke alarm. He coordinated without white-knuckle control. He made it work. When morning came and the power flickered back, someone, an organizer from the county, called with a tentative reprimand. "You need to have these inspections done," she said. "Papers, permits, zoning clearances, a fire marshal's sign-off, an alphabet's worth of municipal attention." The dryer hum in the alley felt like a luxury relative to the spine of bureaucracy. They had to be legitimate. Someone could complain. Someone already had, in the form of a terse email forwarded from a council member who had heard that a truck driver and a pregnant woman were running a community center out of a diner. The wording was not accusatory in tone, but it carried the weight of official suspicion. Maya sat at the small kitchen table and looked at the list of required documents. She could feel, keenly, the pressure of the town's eyes, on her, on the center, on what it meant for a woman alone to take such a public step. Her hands moved seekingly toward a small legal pad where she had written out applications and phone numbers. She wanted the center to be more than a refuge for a night. She wanted it to withstand this sort of bureaucratic gale. "Do you think we can get it?" Mabel asked softly, as if the question asked more of the world than any one person could give. Eli folded his hands around a paper cup of coffee and looked at both of them. "We do it one step at a time," he said. He had an answer then, and it wasn't a promise. He had a plan. Find an inspector who might be sympathetic, adhere to requirements, bring receipts for the grant money, file the articles of incorporation if needed. "I'll go with you," he added, as if walking through a municipal office with someone might be the same kind of practical help as hauling a heater. The notice that a complaint had been filed showed how fragile the line was between goodwill and suspicion. At the diner that night, someone left a flyer under the door. "Who funds Hearth and Hands?" in blocky letters, ink smeared in the wet of last night's snow. It felt like a test they hadn't expected, yet could not ignore, not only for the paperwork, but for the town's sense of itself. Was the town a place that would gather resources to keep its people warm, or would it be a town that watched and cataloged who deserved help? Maya slept badly.
She had always been a person who solved problems by listing them, and now her lists had multiplied into a tree with many branches. Find a registered agent, complete a basic safety inspection, gather 3 character references from locals who could vouch for the group's stability. She knew in the marrow of her that this invitation to public accountability was part of forming the thing she wanted. If Hearth and Hands were to be a place where people learned how to read forms and sign their names, then filling out forms and signing them squarely was part of the curriculum. The morning of the county visit arrived thin and brittle with cold. A woman with a clipboard and a face used to keeping careful distance stood in the doorway and unfolded her inspection like a ruler. She asked questions that had the clean, crisp sound of official process: fire exits, combustible materials, volunteer training logs, a certificate of liability insurance. Do they have one? She listened as Maya answered, not boldly but with competence, and as Eli supplied details about the donated generator, the maintenance checklists, and the names of people who had trained in basic first aid. He did not speak over Maya. He offered the facts she needed when she asked. But the visit also made visible something else, the difference between legality and legitimacy. The inspector could check boxes, but she could not supply the town's blessing. That would come in other ways: the passing nod of a shopkeeper, the parishioner who might mention Hearth and Hands at coffee hour, the school nurse who could refer a pregnant student. Those were the kind of slow, relational approvals that were not enforceable by any municipal code. They relied on humans deciding, privately and publicly, to take someone into their story. After the inspection, the clipboard woman left with a stack of notes. There were items to fix: a better fire extinguisher, a posted evacuation plan, a list of volunteers who had completed a background check. They were actionable, not fatal. The letter suggested a timeline: 3 weeks to comply. For a moment, the world narrowed again to the small radius of possibilities. It was like being back on the shoulder of a highway, but with different stakes. There was another thing that threaded the town, though, and this one was quieter and harder to manage: gossip. Someone slipped a comment to a local reporter that the center was a cover for people taking advantage of taxpayers. Another person, who had watched the sign being painted, crossed the street to avoid eye contact and muttered about being soft on troublemakers. The story drifted like exhausted smoke through the coffee shops and Sunday circles, and it made some of the donors call back and ask for receipts, the way a person asks to see the bottom of a box before buying it again. Maya found herself practicing a public voice she had never needed before. She sat on a folding chair in front of a cluster of neighbors and told them plainly what Hearth and Hands had achieved in its few weeks. 2 women who had enrolled in prenatal programs, a toddler who had a safe place to nap while a mother attended a resume class, a grandmother who'd learned to use a phone to call for vaccinations. She spoke about budgets and schedules and the way small donations stretched thin to meet real needs. She did not beg. She asked, with a kind of humility that has force, for the town to stand with them. Eli sat in the back, hands folded, a quiet presence among the folding chairs. He had come early, had bought a dozen donuts from a baker who would always owe him one. He watched the faces of the town tilt slowly between suspicion and curiosity. When a man with a loud voice accused them of bringing trouble, Eli did not step forward to defend. Maya answered, and her words landed clean and precise. He did what he'd always done when a situation required permanence rather than passion. He kept the generator running in the alley, and made sure the list of volunteers was updated and that the center's basic needs were documented. The town had always been a place of winters. Winters make clear who will show up when the furnace dies and who will leave the streets to the white. Hearth and Hands had been built in the middle of a winter, as a gesture more bold than intended, a shelter not just for bodies but for dignity. The question remained, could they turn that immediate, visible mercy into a long-term fixture? Could a woman's idea and a trucker's practical solidarity become a sustainable thing that outlived the novelty of being a story? That question bent the next few weeks into a new shape. They filled out forms. They learned the art of following up on a referral, the bureaucracy of the county, the habits of donors. Eli took turns driving a van to pick up donated shelving. Maya collected signatures for a small board she wanted to create, a mix of people who believed in the idea, who could sign checks, who could help legitimize the project in eyes that counted. The first public setback came in a plain envelope bearing a county seal. The grant they had applied for, small, a hopeful thing, had been awarded to another project. There was a polite note that said their proposal had been strongly considered, but that funds were limited. There was an encouragement to reapply. In the small logic of those who count grant cycles and fiscal years, it was not a rejection but a delay. To them, it felt like a soft door closing in a moment when they had already started setting furniture inside. "What now?" asked Mabel, folding her hands around the soot mug Eli had helped her into. Maya folded the letter and sat silent for a long breath. The idea of running out of funds had a way of translating into the language of defeat, but defeat wasn't something she allowed to translate into the language of the room.
She had seen enough winters to know that resources shift, people help in different configurations. She had to learn how to ask the town's question differently. Not who is behind this, but why would we let this go? Eli listened to her plan as if it were a navigational chart. Apply for smaller local grants. Host a fundraiser with donated soups from Lou's Diner. Call the union again for a match. Set up a membership where local businesses could become sustaining partners. He offered to host a small convoy of rigs to deliver supplies in exchange for sponsor recognition. He suggested practical things: itemize costs, set clear volunteer hours, make a one-page financial summary that any small donor could read in a minute. The first fundraiser was awkward and humble. It was a soup night in the back room, simple bowls passed by volunteers, a quiet playlist, folding chairs arranged to be near one another. People came who had seen the sign being painted, who wanted to know who would show up in case a storm came. Others came wary, but some people came because they loved the sound of children's laughter behind a glass. The fundraiser didn't reach the total they'd hoped for, but the community pockets contributed enough for another month of utilities and for background checks for volunteers. That night, the center was warm from the breath of people and the kettle that never seemed to stop. A toddler banged a cup on a table and learned rhythm. Maya sat with a volunteer who taught phone use basics, showing a woman how to set up a reminder on her phone for prenatal appointments. There was a tired satisfaction that comes from small forward motion. It is different from triumph. It's the sort of warmth that stays in clothes and doesn't show as a headline. In the weeks that followed, their work attracted attention of a different sort. A local teacher offered to run a literacy class once a week. A retired nurse agreed to possibly volunteer for occasional health check-ins. Eli's union put them in touch with a person who could help with legal paperwork. People started to see the center not as an oddity, but as a neighbor. Small things accumulated: a bookshelf, a donated laptop, a used piano that someone decided might be playable again with a new tuning and a child's hand on the keys. And yet there was a strain. A complaint filed anonymously about safety meant an inspector's second visit came sooner than they'd expected. An article in a regional paper quoted a councilman questioning whether the space had the right zoning. An online message thread whispered that the center was a drain on resources. The wound of being judged reopened, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, precise fretting, like a small animal gnawing through rope. A week before they were to present at a town meeting in order to ask for a formal vote of support, an important symbolic step toward legitimacy, Maya received a call from a number she didn't recognize.
The voice on the other end identified as an investigator from the county's child welfare office. Routine check, they said. They were concerned about ensuring prenatal care and safeguarding. It was meant to be procedural, but the words sat like a stone in the rim of a cup. Maya's heart had a quick, bright drop, the way it had that first night on the shoulder of the highway. The difference now was that she had not only herself to think of. There were the other women who had started to rely on the center,
The volunteers whose time had become a commodity for someone else's stability. The workers who had invested sweat and trust. Eli put a hand on the chair's back and said, "We'll give them what they need. We'll show them our records. We'll ask Mabel to vouch for the way we've run clean checks." He did it without bravado. He did it with the same practical insistence that he used to get a rig across a mountain pass. Break the route into manageable legs. They prepared for the visit. The room trembled with paperwork, volunteer forms, logs, a schedule of classes, receipts for donations. They made a binder and labeled sections. Maya practiced the sort of steady, simple answers that make a practical voice. What they did, how they did it, who supervised, who had what role. She would answer clearly. She would not offer drama. She would show the unadorned lessons of their work. The night before the visit, a flurry of messages arrived from people who had benefited. Short texts, gratitude notes. The town's kid who helped paint the sign showed up with a drawing of a baby son, colored with crayons. It was the kind of gesture that rouses courage. Maya slept with the binder beneath her pillow, and a tight hope that this would not unravel into something that would undo months of small, steady labor. Morning came thin and bright. They set the kettle to boil. Eli checked the generator one last time. The county investigator would arrive in an hour. The town meeting would be in 7 days. The complaint would be a headline in someone's mind before it ever reached paper. The line between being a favored neighbor and being a cause celeb was thinner than they had imagined. As the investigator's car cut through the white and stopped outside Hearth and Hands, a new storm blew in, not of snow, but of questions. The work they had started, painted signs, donated chairs, volunteered time, a woman who refused to let abandonment define her, had reached a point where the town could choose to support them or let small mercies be extinguished by doubt. Eli opened the door before anyone knocked. He stood there, hands in his pockets, as the investigator stepped in and scanned the room. Maya felt the breath of the place condense into a moment. Around them, the kettle hummed. The donated piano sat silent in the corner, its keys closed like a mouth waiting to tell a story.
"Let's get the binder," Eli said, and his voice had the patient steadiness of someone who had navigated worse blizzards and come through with a map of what needed to be done. He looked at Maya, then at the woman who had come to check their papers, and for the first time, a quiet fear and a quiet resolve lined up in her chest. There was a beat where everything held its breath, the inspector's pen poised, the kettle's whistle forgotten, the town's future narrow as a threat. Then the investigator asked the first question, about volunteer background checks, and the room filled with the sound of people answering, of names read aloud, of receipts produced like talismans. They were not prepared for an assault. They were prepared for ordinary accountability. Outside, the winter light made the snow glint like a promise and like a test. Inside, the group of volunteers and residents and a trucker and a woman who had once stood on a highway shoulder gathered around a binder that contained boxes checked and tasks done. It was not the end of anything. It was the middle of a story where every small, honest thing mattered. The investigator paused, flipping through pages. Her face, unreadable at first, softened in a way that might have been approval or might have been obliging politeness. She marked a few items with a pen and then closed the binder. "This is organized," she said. "You'll need a few more things, but I think you're on the right track." Relief arrived like a small, warm current. People exhaled. A volunteer nearly cried. Eli leaned against the doorframe and took off his cap, rubs of grease at his hairline. Maya folded her hands and let a tired smile break. For the first time in a long while, a night on the shoulder of an interstate felt like the origin story of something that might last. And yet, as the investigator left with her clipboard and a list of items to follow up on, a car idled across the street. A woman rolled down her window and called out, voice edged with that particular kind of sharpness that comes when fear needs a direction. "Do you have a permit to run this?" she asked. "What's to stop people from just showing up?" The question hung there, not aggressive but exacting. It suggested not only administrative issues but the latent worry of townspeople who measure change in neat parcels. Does a new presence diminish their sense of control? Does it unsettle the map? Eli met the voice with a simple, honest reply. "We're doing our best," he said. "If folks want to help, we're taking volunteers. If folks want to learn more, come by." The woman muttered something and drove off. The town's choices would keep arriving like this. Small, testy, sometimes generous. Maya watched a car pull away and felt sharply how fragile progress can be. Even success can be a way station to the next argument. They had won a small victory with the inspector's nod,
But the works of sustained charity are not built on single approvals.
They are built on the patience to file a dozen forms, the endurance to wait for donations, the temperament to return again when a storm makes the world white and unclear. They had enough to keep Hearth and Hands open for now. They had not yet reached the point where the place could stand without the skin of their combined labor. Eli cleaned up while Maya started checking the items on the list the investigator had left. Outside, snow began to fall again, and the streetlights turned the flakes into slow, soft coins. The town's future, as ever, would be decided in increments: a permit granted or delayed, a donation pledged or rescinded, a rumor embraced or corrected. They had a meeting scheduled on Monday with the town council, a public space where hearts and grants and reputations were weighed. They had volunteers signed up for the literacy course. They had a toddler who had learned to clap to a new rhythm, and a woman who had started to register for prenatal appointments. They had a piano that someone promised to tune. Maya closed the binder and wrote, "Town meeting, Monday, 7 p.m. Speak to council." Her handwriting had acquired a firmness over the weeks. She looked at Eli. "Will you come?" she asked. He shrugged, a simple honesty. "I drove through worse blizzards than your town meeting. I'll be there." His eyes were steady. "Besides, I want to hear what you say." She smiled, not because she needed convincing, but because she had learned that the truth of what she said mattered differently when people listened. She had also learned that the thing she wanted, safety, not spectacle, could be wrenched open or closed by people who were as practical as they were prejudiced. They locked the back door that night and set candles in jars along the tables. The piano remained in the corner like a promise half made. In the street, a delivery truck passed by slowly, two men inside watching the sign that read Hearth and Hands and nodding as if to mark a place on a map. The story had begun with a roadside stop in a storm. A thermos passed over to a woman who had been left alone. It had grown into a small community effort: painted signs, a binder of receipts, a generator humming in an alley. It had gathered people who could not resist the sound of a child's laugh, and it had attracted the attention of those who measure risk before they measure care. And on the morning of the town meeting, when the street still smelled of snow and the town's main hall filled with folding chairs, Maya felt the old shadow at the edge of her skin, the old shame, the old fear that people would decide she didn't deserve a place at the table. She gripped the binder she had prepared and breathed in the smell of the paper, the evidence of months of small labor. Eli leaned in and tapped the back of her hand. "You have them," he said. "You just tell them what Hearth and Hands is." She nodded. She would speak.
She would not let the line between abandonment and belonging be decided by those who never had to fear sleeping on a highway. She would tell the town what their small acts had already done for people: tuition for classes, a place to warm up, a step toward motherhood that was steadier because someone would help fill out a form. As the main hall filled and murmurs rose like a tide, the air seemed full of choices. People who had once avoided the corner where the sign was painted now took seats. The councilmen arrived with their suits and clipboards. The woman who had left a flyer under the door sat 3 seats away, arms folded defensively over a purse. The room settled into a low hum, paper shuffling, the scrape of chair legs, the sort of civic murmuring that can either become a chorus of neighbors or a roll of distant thunder. Maya felt the binder like an extra weight in her hands, not because it was heavy, but because it held the thin, particular proofs of months of small labor: receipts, volunteer rosters, a list of classes, signatures. It had the smell of paper and effort. When the meeting began, the mayor read the agenda in a voice used to governing small, measured things: time and place, public comment period, budget reports. Hearth and Hands was scheduled near the end, an item people could either treat as a nuisance or a necessity. The room was full. Some had come to support, some to ask questions, and some simply to see whose side the town would take. A councilman with a neat part in his hair and an even neater tie rose first. He spoke calmly and with the authority of someone who made decisions with spreadsheets. "We have had a complaint filed," he said, "and several concerns. Are there clear safety protocols? Do we have a liability carrier? Who is legally responsible if something goes wrong?" His questions were valid on their surface. They were also the language some used to displace worry that felt like resentment. One by one, people rose and spoke. A young mother who had learned to enroll for WIC at Hearth and Hands described how last month she had been on the verge of missing an appointment until someone there had called the clinic and arranged a ride. A retired teacher, Mabel, spoke about the afternoon class for literacy and how a woman who had been illiterate as an adult now read prescriptions aloud for her own medicine.
Gail, the convenience store clerk, stood up, hands nodded, and said plainly, "I've given them coffee and I pay attention. People here are doing the work, not begging for pity. They're helping folks to stand." Opposition came as well. The woman who had left the flyer clucked about precedent and allowing anyone to set up shop. A man who ran a small hardware store worried about liability and insisted that the center needed a formal board and insurance before it took any more donations.
A few voices expressed the same quiet fear that had chased Maya from her parents' house, the terror that resources stretched thin would be diverted to those deemed unworthy. When Maya stood, the room leaned in a way she had not expected. She had rehearsed this in front of a kettle and a stack of volunteer forms 100 times, but rehearsal is a different heat from the real thing. She smoothed her shirt, set the binder on the lectern, and let the silence teach her the pace. "Good evening," she said simply. Her voice did not tremble. Hearth and Hands started because one night a woman stood on the side of the highway and someone stopped. That person, Eli, gave us a thermos, a blanket, and a promise he'd keep a word. From that promise, people have been showing up. We have a schedule of volunteers who have passed background checks. We keep logs of donations and receipts. We have a generator and a plan for outages. We are not asking you to replace our work. We're asking you to help make it lawful and safe for the long term, so we can serve more people and teach others how to do the same. She reached for the practical things first, the checklist that the inspector had suggested, the names of nurses who had volunteered for monthly visits, the simple one-page budget that Eli had helped her make. She showed attendance numbers, then a brief list of outcomes, women enrolled in prenatal clinics, resumes written with new confidence, a toddler who had been placed on a vaccination schedule because someone at Hearth and Hands had called the health department. "I'm not here to make this about me," Maya said, and on purpose she did not tell a long origin story. "I'm here to ask for a conditional support, help with liability insurance, help connecting with the county's social services for stable referrals, and a letter of support from the council so we can apply for a small capacity building grant. We can provide the logs, we can meet the inspections, we will run the place transparently." She spoke with a quiet competence that had been hammered by months of filling out forms, by nights of counting cans, by conversations with volunteers who trusted her enough to say what they needed. When she finished, her voice held an odd, slow power, the sound of someone who had been overlooked for reasons she could not forget, but who had learned methods that made oversight a tool, not a weapon. There was a pause. Then, predictably, someone at the back raised the specter of precedent. What happens when Hearth and Hands leaves? Will the town be left to cover the ongoing costs? Would it become a farm of dependency? Eli answered that question without stepping into the role of spokesperson. He had not come to the microphone to guard a place with a show of muscle. He had come as a steady, practical presence, and when he spoke it was in the same register as his first night on the highway. "We're asking for a partnership," he said, "not to live off the town.
We want to be self-sustaining. We plan to apply for grants, to run a modest membership for local businesses who want to be sustaining partners, to host classes that will help people find work, and to create a small social enterprise, sewing, food kits, that sort of thing, to cover operational costs. We'll keep books, we'll have a board, and we'll make sure donors can see how money is used." He did not make it about being a veteran in the cold. He made it about logistics. It mattered. People trusted pragmatic language. It was the kind of language a person in a rig used to file a route sheet. One by one, voices that had been wary found a way to speak differently. A local nurse pledged to volunteer time if the center could promise a clean room for basic checks. The diner owner Lou said he'd donate soup once a week if they could help some of his seasonal workers fill out forms for housing assistance. The hardware store owner who had feared liability offered to host a first aid training in his back room if volunteers completed a schedule of shifts. Homes in small, cautious ways were reaching out. When the council took a vote, it was not unanimous. That was not the point. What mattered was that the council agreed to a conditional letter of support and to host a technical assistance meeting with county social services to help Hearth and Hands secure basic insurance and file incorporation documents. The vote was a narrow but decisive step. A local authority had recognized their work as real, and the town had chosen, however hesitantly, to be part of the solution. Outside the hall, under the thin stars pricked into the winter sky, Maya and Eli walked back toward the diner. The air felt both cold and lighter. People who had come to watch now stopped to say thank you as if they were tracking a tiny vessel whose course they had once doubted. A neighbor she'd never seen before handed her a small envelope, cash, and a note that read simply, "For paint." Small, precise gestures that become the architecture of trust. The next months were a rhythm of progress and ordinary setbacks.
They filed articles of incorporation with the help of a lawyer who volunteered time after learning about the center from a radio piece. The union that Eli belonged to agreed to a modest monthly match to cover basic utilities for 3 months while they pursued grants. A local church allowed them to use a meeting room for the background check workshops they'd need to run. They raised funds through soup nights and quiet donations. They applied for smaller county grants and learned the discipline of follow-up calls, budgets, and audit trails. The first winter passed with a series of small victories: the purchase of liability insurance that fit the center's modest risk profile, the installation of a safer stove, and agreement with the county nurse for once-a-month clinic hours. The board formed, a mix of people who had worked on paint nights and those who knew how to read municipal forms.
Maya's name appeared in corporate documents as co-founder and program director. It was a title that matched the work she had done and a legal safeguard. The center would be governed by more than a single person or a single kindness. Hearth and Hands found ways to generate modest income to keep its lights on. Mabel ran literacy classes that doubled as donations drives for books. Lou's Diner pledged a regular soup night where customers could buy a bowl for the center, and the hardware store sold support cards that allowed people to contribute a small monthly sum at the register. Volunteers taught sewing classes that produced small, saleable items, simple aprons, insulated lunch bags that covered some supply costs. These were not get-rich schemes. They were practical, community-based solutions that echoed Maya's original aim, to make a place that helped people gain skills and dignity. The town's attitude shifted with the accumulation of small, visible proofs. A kindergarten teacher who had once been skeptical began to refer families for the center's parenting nights. A councilwoman who had voted against them the first time now attended a class to learn how to help constituents fill out housing applications. People who had folded their arms at the sign's early days now asked about volunteer schedules. Still, sustainability required constant labor. There were grant rejections that felt like blows, phone calls that ended with silence, a winter when the heater sputtered and a donor deferred a promised match. The team learned what it meant to pivot, cutting a class to pay for a roof repair, postponing a new outreach program until the books balanced. The small business enterprise of sewn goods did not explode into profit, but it taught budgeting and gave volunteers something to measure each month. What neither the paperwork nor the funders could quantify was the quiet, human work that had become Hearth and Hands' daily engine. A woman who had once been too ashamed to show her face in public now taught a weekly session on infant care. A young man who had started cleaning tables for a few dollars more than pocket money learned the bookkeeping basics and became the center's first paid part-time coordinator, a role that meant steady hours and a paycheck for someone who had not had either in years. Small lives were stabilizing in ways that would, over time, change more than one family. The town's winter the following year was harsher than the first. A storm ripped a section of the center's roof, and water leaked into a corner where the donated piano sat. The damage could have been a death blow. Repairing the roof would cost more than they'd saved. It was a test that was equal parts practical and symbolic. Could a small community protect the place that had protected them? Eli's response was unadorned competence. He organized a convoy of local drivers, semi-drivers who could lift pallets, a neighbor who had a truck, a handyman who knew roofing.
He called in favors with the economy of a man who owed and was owed back the help that keeps people moving. He arranged a workday and brought coffee in a thermos that smelled of strong roast. People showed up. Teenagers from the high school who needed community service hours, Lou and his staff for sandwiches, Mabel with an extra set of mittens. They worked for 2 bitter days under tarps and heaters, and the roof was patched enough to keep the rain out until they could raise funds to replace it properly. The work was a revelation to some townsfolk who had once doubted. They saw hands calloused from different trades coming together, truck drivers hauling beams, a retired teacher holding a ladder, a young mother balancing a baby on her hip while she handed a nail. It was the kind of civic theater that teaches a town what it looks like to care for its own. The tile on the roof was temporary, but the knowledge that the community would show up was permanent. When a local foundation later offered a small capital grant for emergency repairs, Hearth and Hands had the documentation to accept it. They presented the receipts, the photos of the volunteer workday, and the board's minutes. The foundation approved the replacement roof on the condition that they attend a nonprofit management workshop. Maya, Eli, and Mabel drove to the workshop and sat among names and agendas, learning the vocabulary of grant management. The center's operation got more formal, its pulse steadying into something less improvised and more administratively resilient. And life, as it does, continued, pregnancy bending toward its natural endpoint. Maya's belly grew, and the center's rhythm adjusted around it. She arranged scheduled breaks,
recruited additional volunteers for the weekly classes she led, and trained a deputy coordinator, the young man who had learned bookkeeping, to cover administrative tasks when she went into the hospital. She kept the legal pad near her hand and taught volunteers the habit of leaving clear notes. The space was no longer only about survival. It was about passing on practices that would ensure continuity. When her labor began, late at night, a wind off the hills and snow dusting the windows, she called the number for the county clinic that had been on the list Eli gave her that first week. Gail helped arrange a ride. The center's volunteer nurse met her at the hospital and stayed through the first hours after delivery. Eli, who had stayed respectfully by the perimeter the entire pregnancy, present but not intrusive, was at the hospital entrance when the night shift changed. He waited in the quiet way of someone who understood the need for boundaries. He paced the corridor once, and then sat reading a magazine he had brought because he had been told he might have to wait. The birth itself was a medical process, attended by professionals, and it concluded with the thin human miracle of a new life announced without drama.
A small, healthy baby with a tuft of dark hair and fingers like little proof marks. The nurses wrapped the infant in hospital blankets and placed the child on Maya's chest. Maya cried, not from pain now, but from a kind of careful, fierce joy. She named the baby by a word that had been in her head for months, a name that felt like an incantation of hopes she had whispered while counting options in motel rooms. After a day in the hospital, with feeding established and a pediatrician's nod that was plain and practical, Maya returned to Hearth and Hands with the baby in a car seat and a volunteer nurse who would come by for the first week. The center welcomed them like a harbor. A small group of women who had been part of the prenatal circle came with casseroles and a soft blanket. Someone had tuned the piano, a child banged the keys and found, clumsily, the beginning of a melody. Maya's re-entry into leadership after childbirth was not miraculous. She was tired. Her hands bore the small, persistent marks of postpartum work. Yet she also carried a new legitimacy in the room, not because she had been rescued, but because she had shown the labor of constructing a place that could hold life into being. She continued to lead classes, now with a baby in a sling during lighter sessions, teaching young mothers the same things she had wanted to learn: how to navigate forms, how to advocate with a clinic, how to set up a simple monthly budget. In the months that followed, Hearth and Hands expanded its offerings. A basic computer class allowed people to apply for jobs online. A shared childcare schedule enabled volunteers to attend training. A small cooperative selling hand-stitched goods became a modest income stream. The established board negotiated a small, affordable lease with the diner owner who had once donated soup, and the center moved toward stability. The photo on the center's wall, the first night Eli found Maya on the shoulder of the road, remained, not as a haunting, but as a map of where things had started. Eli's role continued to be what it had always been: practical, consistent, and respectfully bounded. He became the center's logistics manager by mutual agreement, responsible for transport of donated items, for keeping the generator maintained, for coordinating the volunteers who could move heavy things. He sat on the board as a community member with a clear-eyed sense of what it meant to keep a place functioning in a town with real seasonal needs. His name carried a particular credibility among drivers who might otherwise have seen a center like Hearth and Hands as someone else's problem. Over time, the town learned to measure the center by the work it did, not the origin story that had raised eyebrows.
The council awarded them a small 2-year sustainability grant, contingent on matching funds. The union committed to a modest monthly donation. Local businesses organized an annual Hearth Day with a small festival where proceeds supported the center's emergency fund. People who had once been skeptics now volunteered to sit on panels to advise other towns starting similar projects. The center's small victories multiplied. There were moments of tenderness between Maya and Eli, silent exchanges over coffee at the back of the room, a hand on the small of her back the week she returned from the hospital, a brief hug following the first successful audit. Those moments were never spectacle. If their relationship deepened beyond partnership, it did so slowly, with consent and mutual respect, and it never became the center's story. The company's title was always Hearth and Hands. The center belonged first to the people it served. Years later, the baked-in warmth of the place had a different quality. The paint on the sign had been reapplied 3 times. The piano had been tuned twice, and now served as the center's music corner, where a retired music teacher offered Saturday lessons for toddlers. A small bookshelf carried stories in multiple languages. A wall displayed the names of volunteers and donors. A framed copy of the Articles of Incorporation hung next to a child's crayon drawing of a sun with a little house beneath it. Maya's child grew into a person who learned to clap to rhythms and to reach for the piano keys with sticky fingers. He became, in the center's life, a living testament to what practical care can hold. He would someday learn about the night on the highway and the thermos and the blanket, but those were the preface. The body of the story was the daily grind of meetings, the slow pile-up of receipts, the volunteers who never stopped showing up. At an annual gathering that had become a town tradition, people clustered in the center's warming room. Children ran around with mismatched mittens. Someone had baked a stack of cookies. Lou's Diner supplied the soup, and the pianist, an old woman who had once been a music teacher, played a tune that began small and rose into something communal. Eli stood by the doorway watching the room fill with noise, laughter and small crises. The lost mitten, the spilled juice, answered with the practical attention of people who knew how to step in. Maya stood for a moment on the steps of the center, her baby, now toddling, on her hip, the board's list of names in her pocket. She watched the scene unfolding. A child pounding a spoon on a bowl in rhythm, an older woman showing a young mother how to tie a shoelace, a volunteer teaching a man how to fill out a job application online. The cold of the highway that had once been a horizon in her life had become a distant geography. Here was a place that had kept people from being invisible.
Eli walked up beside her and stood in the quiet, not as a rescuer, but as a fellow steward. They exchanged a look that held thanks and the possibility of more. There was no rush to define it. The room behind them was warm in color and sound, the former diner lights glowing like a promise kept. She touched his arm lightly. "We did what we set out to do," she said. He smiled, small and certain. "You set it out. I helped haul the parts." They laughed softly. Outside, a truck idled like a remembered engine, a rig passing through town with headlights like the first night. Someone on the porch waved at its driver. Inside, the melody on the piano wound up, and children answered with voices. The sign above the door, Hearth and Hands, swayed slightly in a winter breeze, and glittered with slats of ice like a wreath. What that lone trucker did changed her life. He stopped the night she was invisible. He kept a promise. He offered tools and steady presence. But what they built together changed a town, a place where people learned to read forms, to hold a child's hand through a fever, to show up with tarps when a roof threatened to collapse. It became a map for how ordinary, repeated kindness, grounded in practical action and civic accountability, could become an infrastructure for dignity. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that small acts add up. Tell us in the comments who once stopped for you.